welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. My name is Dean Detloff. I'm a Catholic PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto.
I'm Matt Bernico. I teach media studies at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois. We're talking with Vincent Lloyd. He is the Associate Professor of Theology and Religious Studies at Villanova University. If you'll recall, if you're a true Magnificast fan, you'll remember that we talked with Vincent back in episode 6 about some research he did on Huey P. Newton and prison abolition. And this week we're talking to him again about a new book that he just had come out called In Defense of Charisma. It's coming out next month on Columbia Press, so you got to make sure you get it because it's real neat. Definitely a book that stands out. It's not a book that I've read before with a different name or anything. It's pretty unique.
Yeah, I think so. It's also really easy to read. It's not, you don't get bogged down in like a bunch of jargon. There's a lot of really good prose, and he talks about a lot of like books that are popular and popular movements, popular people. So it's easy to track with, and that's a nice, refreshing thing to read, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
But first, before we do that, I have to say it that way because that's how Julie Chen says it on Big Brother, and Big Brother Celebrity Edition just finished. So I got that but first stuck in my head, you know. Just a side note, Big Brother's extremely good, and Big Brother Canada is starting next week, and you just gotta get on it. I need more people to talk to about it. No one will talk to me about it, and you're all missing out. Apart from that, though, we finally have a new iTunes review.
Let's do it, but let me just tell you, you guys need to submit more iTunes reviews. Even if you already submitted one, submit another one. No one cares. There's no police here. There's no one's gonna turn you into iTunes jail. And even if they did, we'd get you out.
We would bail you out.
So just get back on iTunes and give us some more of these good reviews.
That's why we get the Patreon money. It's bail money for iTunes jail.
That's exactly what it is. Yeah. All right. Okay, so we have a review this week that's titled A Life-Changing Experience. 5 out of 5 stars. So
nailed it.
Off to a pretty good start. Yeah, nailed it. Okay, so this user writes, The Magnificast gives moments of knowledge, understanding, fun, and joy while providing new information and creating interesting and entertaining discussions. This podcast is a beautiful place for Christianity and leftist politics to be. Oh my gosh, this is so nice. If you have felt before, as I have, a communist without a party and a Christian without a church, that's a good line that we did not come up with, then there you can find colleagues, comrades, friends, by sharing moments and spreading how one is far from alone in this position as a Christian on the left with fellows like John Greenaway, Rev Left Radio, Friendly Anarchism, and more. And here, one can truly belong and learn and have fun with a unique podcast that has settled my troubled conscience and definitely changed my life in a truly fantastic way. Here's to a whole lot more fun and good content, TM. Wow, that is we've had nice reviews in the past, but that one's the nicest.
Yeah,
I think.
The word I would use to describe that review is wholesome. Just a real wholesome hug of a review.
They said our podcast was beautiful.
They really did.
Well, that's not a word I would have ever used. I appreciate that.
Yeah, same. There's a lot of beauty going on in that review, which I appreciate despite feeling that we don't deserve it, haven't earned it. But maybe in the future. I mean, there's a good benediction at the end of there, so we'll just try to live up to it. It's a good ideal to strive to, this review. Cool. Well, that's a good review. Like Matt said, keep sending them in. Also, specifically for Canadians, we, for some reason, iTunes separates reviews between the US and Canada, and we only have 6 reviews from Canada, despite the fact that we also have statistics that say more than 6 people in Canada listen to the show. So, you know what to do. I'm not trying to put these Canadian listeners on blast, but I mean, also I am.
Yeah, no. Come on, Canadian listeners. Help us out. All right. I'm putting you on blast because I'm from America. I'm from the United States. Okay. One last thing before we turned over to Vincent. I'm so sorry. One last thing is always 3 more things, but here we go. One last thing. Next week is our 50th episode. Whoa. That's crazy.
That's a lot of episodes.
I can't even believe it. It's so many episodes. Well, to celebrate, we're going to talk about the podcast a little bit and reflect on it. Just think about the long road that we've been on this whole time. And also, we're going to take all of the questions and comments that you guys have to offer us. So this episode could be extremely good or extremely bad, just all up to you guys. So if you want to see us fail, then this is your chance to not do anything.
You have to listen to it, so it's like you're really just hurting yourself.
It's true. You are really hurting yourself. So if you have questions, concerns, thoughts, or comments about the Magnificast brand, the Magnificast line of products, please send those thoughts to us at themagnificast@gmail.com. Or if you're feeling really adventurous, call us at 815-408-0745. In the past, we've had some problems with the old voicemail, but I think it's fixed. I'm pretty sure we got to figure it all out. So just follow proper phone call etiquette, in which you put your ear to one end of the phone and your voice, your mouth at the other end, and then just speak directly into the receiver. Clearly, confidently, you just tell us what you think about us. So it'd be great to hear like what you guys think are your favorite episodes, who your favorite guests, I don't know, other weird questions or thoughts you might have, anything that you've ever wanted to know about Christian leftism but we're just way too embarrassed to ask. All of those things are things you could ask us, so please do that. Yeah, I don't know, it'll be a fun episode, I think, to sit back and reflect on all of the really great things that we've done with our lives so far.
All right, well, as you can see, we really need somebody to help us think about charisma, and we're going to turn to Vincent Lloyd to do that. So thanks, Vincent, for coming back on the Magnificast. It's great to have you back on. We actually, in our last episode, we were reading some Huey P. Newton stuff, and we were thinking back on the last time you were on episode 6, which feels like forever ago now, when we talked to you about Huey P. Newton. So it's great to have you back on, hear about what you're working on now. For folks who, I guess, aren't too familiar, you teach at Villanova, and you do a lot of really fascinating research on theology and politics and prison abolition and a bunch of interesting other things that we can get into as we go. But just to start out, we should just ask, what have you been up to lately among the many, many activities that you've been doing in the last month or so?
Well, thanks for having me back on. It's great to see that the Magnificast is flourishing over the last several months here. Yeah, I've been traveling around and giving some talks recently. I was visiting down in Greenville, which was a lot of fun, getting to know the community down there. And before that, I got to see Dean in person, in the flesh, in Atlanta at this Political Theology Network conference. We're trying to bring together theologians, religious studies scholars, and folks from other humanities departments who are thinking with the concept of political theology in all sorts of ways, and deepening the engagement with religious traditions while also sort of sharpening our critical tools from the sort of theory side. So we're trying to bring folks together who might not usually be in the same room, the same sort of conference together, along with some activists as well, which, I thought was a good experience.
Yeah, it was a great time. I had a great time anyway. So
yeah,
I was looking forward to seeing how that develops.
Yeah, I think it will. There are a lot of possible directions that it can go, and it's always hard balancing the pressures toward institutionalization and professionalization on the one hand, and the sort of vibrancy of the real people having real conversations about real stuff that they care about on the other, and hopefully we can collectively figure out a way to keep that balance so everyone's happy and everyone can keep doing good work and having fun.
Yeah, that's a good challenge. Though having fun is a value I really appreciate among academic conferences. So good on you for caring about that. Matt, how about you? What have you been up to these days?
I just got back from a conference in LA. That was fun. I went to the College Art Association conference and learned about art. Lots of good art out there. But I'm also psyched to no longer be in LA and be back home. That's very fun. Yeah. What have you been doing, Dean?
Not too much. I had a birthday last week. That was a good time. Played some games with my friends, and Emily bought me a bunch of like really delicious and garbage like food that I was indulging in for a week. It's weird having a birthday in Lent. I feel like there's sort of a strange irony there, but I give right into it. I feel like God probably gets it, so I think that's cool. I'm coming down from the birthday high, getting back into regular life, and trying to finish a bunch of projects. But one of those projects, here's a great just forced transition into what we're going to talk about today. One of those projects has been reading Vincent's new book on charisma, which is really fun, and we were sort of lucky enough to get an advanced reading of that. It's a really, really great book, super accessible and fun to read. But usually when we have people on, Vincent, we ask them to give an elevator pitch of the piece of writing that we're going to talk about so that everyone's kind of on the same page. So if you could just sort of introduce us into what the book's about, why you wanted to write it, and what people should expect from it.
Sure. Thanks to both of you for taking a look at this text, and it's good to hear that it's readable and accessible. I was really trying to go for that, and sort of using examples from popular culture or literature or stories to sort of engage readers in thinking about charisma. So the worry that the book starts with is that charisma is a bad thing, right? You might think about Hitler as a sort of paradigm of bad charisma, but you also might think about sort of feminist or grassroots critiques of Martin Luther King, right, as sort of taking all of the energy from the civil rights movement and taking the media spotlight and making people forget about all the hard work that on the ground organizers have been doing, not just contemporaneous with King, but for generations before. And the work that women have been doing, the work that queer folks have been doing, and I think the racial justice organizers today, right around Black Lives Matter and other movements, are really, really great on saying, we need to be suspicious of leaders who are getting in the media spotlight. We need to be suspicious of charisma, right? So the book is sort of starting with this suspicion that we rightly have of charisma, but also saying, there's something really important and powerful about a quiet kind of charisma, a democratic kind of charisma, a kind of charisma that gets us asking new questions, right? That gets us thinking more about our humanity, that sort of taps into our deepest desires, not just our sort of superficial desires to be pleased by a nice performance or to hear what we want to hear, but that our desires for the good, the true, and the beautiful, right, which can't be fulfilled by what the powers that be in the world want to give us right away in a minute or an hour. But that really call for deep questioning and deep interrogation of self and world, that deeper kind of charisma that we know from neighbors or relatives or colleagues, or that we sort of encounter on a bus trip across the city, sometime talking to someone, a stranger we just happened to strike up a conversation with. That's the kind of charisma that I think is really important to name and to hold up, even as we're worrying about and criticizing a bad kind of charisma.
Yeah, you introduced this dichotomy that runs throughout the book between authoritarian and democratic charisma. That's what you call those two. What do those mean for you? And we're going to return to it a few times, so it'd probably be helpful to flag that up front, I think.
Sure. So I call authoritarian charisma the kind of charisma that gives you answers, the kind of charisma where you cede your own capacity to judge to the charismatic figure and just sort of accept the judgments of that charismatic figure. That's authoritarian charisma. Democratic charisma is a kind of charisma that invites you to ask new questions, right? Invites you to tap into your deepest desires and pursue them, knowing that there won't be sort of easy answers, around. Kind of charisma that reveals what's most fundamentally human rather than concealing it, right? Authoritarian charisma is concealing what's human behind a sort of veneer, a sort of sleekness of the performance.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's an interesting way to break it down, I think. Well, on that point, when I was reading through at least the introduction of your book, I kept coming back to the term charisma and like what that actually means and how it functions. So, and to me, it seemed kind of similar to the idea of rhetoric. But I wonder how you would differentiate those terms. So, like, why did you choose the term charisma rather than like rhetoric or eloquence? It's another word associated with speaking a lot. So, why charisma?
Oh, it's a great question. So what I want to think about with charisma, I mean, etymologically, the word comes from the sort of sense of a gift. Sometimes it's talked about in terms of a sort of divine gift. And, I want to think about, in theological terms, the image of God in the human, right, as this sort of divine gift that we have that's often concealed, right, that ideology conceals, right, that, the being caught up in the everyday worries and everyday life conceals. And I want to think about, when does that gift, right, that the gift of the image of God in the human, when is that accessible, right? When can we catch a glimpse of that? That's what I want to see happening in this democratic charisma. So in rhetoric or eloquence, those are tools that are employed to achieve specific ends that someone might have. Whereas in charisma, right, it's about not a worldly end that the speaker desires, but in democratic charisma, it's about the calling attention to the human itself, right? The image of God in the human, which is the most essential part of the human. So it's not about something in the world or getting something that you want in the world, but actually calling viewers beyond the world, right? To reflect on why the world doesn't satisfy them, and that's what democratic charisma at its best does. Whereas authoritarian charisma, I see as a way that ideology circulates, right? So this is a criticism of celebrities, of course, but also sort of totalitarian political figures, right, that there are sort of set of ideas of the wealthy and the powerful, and how do we think that they're okay? Well, one way is celebrities who we look up to tell us that they're okay or make us feel okay with these ideas of the wealthy and the powerful, whether they're ideas about capitalism or patriarchy or nationalism or racism. Those ideas are sort of embodied in these figures of authoritarian charisma, sometimes celebrities that really function as catalysts for that ideology.
That's so cool. I like that elaboration of charisma so much. So I'm a person that has to teach a public speaking course every now and again. And usually, like, when you do those types of things, like, rhetoric is sort of like the choice of word. Like, that's what, you're learning persuasion, you're learning how to speak. And charisma often ends up being sort of a subset of rhetoric. But the way that you've done it here is pretty neat and interesting to me, just because, like, now charisma subsumes rhetoric, and it adds sort of like a moral impetus behind charisma, or at least a possible moral impetus. So that's really neat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one way I try to think about it is in terms of the difference between the sophists and Socrates, right? So the rhetoric that is sort of employed by people getting paid in ancient Greece to persuade people of something, right, can be very slick, can be very use the right words to appeal to the emotions, to give people answers, to make the sophist's judgment seem like the audience, make the audience feel as if their own judgment is the same as the sophist's judgment. Mm-hmm. Whereas Socrates, also has a kind of charisma, right? If we imagine what Socrates looks like, is like interacting in the marketplace, right? It's not a very slick kind of charisma, right? Socrates is sometimes described as being ugly, right? Sometimes, he's not the most put together, doesn't always choose exactly the word that will instantly persuade or instantly make the person hearing feel good, right? Sometimes what Socrates says provokes resistance, right? But Socrates is ultimately, there is something seductive about Socrates. Still, it's a different kind of seduction, right? It's a seduction that isn't about desiring Socrates; it's about desiring the good, and breaking through the conventional wisdom, right? Breaking through the wisdom of the world at the time, the wisdom of the ancient Greek world, to think deeper. So I want to hold up that kind of democratic charisma that Socrates exemplifies. Or that Moses, in another sense, exemplifies. Moses is a kind of equivocal figure. On the one hand, we think Moses, we think of, big, strong guy, on the mountain talking to God, but that's really Charlton Heston, not Moses, right? It's the sort of image we have from the movies, right? Which is really about America and manhood and whiteness, right? Which, seems quite different from, the Moses of the Bible who stuttered, right? The Moses of the Bible who has to go through Aaron, has to go through the Israelite elders, right? Can't sort of directly communicate with anyone, right? There are all these sort of layers of mediation involved in Moses, and who isn't really telling people exactly what to do, but inviting a kind of questioning, right? So, Moses, like many of the figures of charisma that all of the figures of charisma that I'm trying to reflect on in the book, is equivocal, right? There, we might represent Moses as having this kind of authoritarian charisma, but one can sort of dig deeper and find a kind of democratic charisma there as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, I think. Speaking of sort of, since you're making this connection between a religious figure like Moses and charisma, we have this ongoing campaign against Joel Osteen on this podcast. We're trying to slowly dislodge him on the religious and spirituality podcast popularity charts on iTunes. And maybe you can help us out here. So in your introduction, you call out prosperity gospels or prosperity gospel preachers specifically as an example of charisma and a sort of dangerous, I guess, religious seduction. Could you tell us a little bit more about that connection between authoritarian charisma and religion? I think that's something that a lot of, especially leftists, worry about when they hear religion, right? There's this critique of people kind of get sucked in by a weird version of the opium of the masses or something like that, and then they can't think for themselves and they never address these material problems, right? And someone like Joel Osteen is, I guess, a good obvious example of that. How does that connection work, authoritarian and charisma and religion?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think it certainly is a worry, and in the sort of popular imagination, right? The preacher who is talking about God but is really concerned with money, right, is a sort of paradigm of bad charisma, right? The sort of sleekness that has a content that seems holy but has an effect which is very worldly and very sort of self-aggrandizing. And self-enriching, right? So that certainly that's something to worry about. And in general, the project of the book is to say, charisma is something that we need to worry about, and we need to find tools for discernment, with respect to, right? So when we encounter, we shouldn't encounter charisma and say, this is bad, let's go away. We shouldn't encounter charisma and say, tell me more, I want to hear this. This is giving me what I want. We need sort of tools for discernment and, reflection on how we can distinguish, the charisma that's calling us beyond the road, the charisma that's holding us down in the world. And I think it's all the more true for religious charisma, but I think one of the things I try to do throughout the book is think about how this authoritarian charisma at its worst is circulating capital, but also very much tied in with other bad things, right? Nationalism, right? The sort of patriarchy, right? Sort of father figure in a sense, right? A father is the first figure of charisma, right? Who's telling you what I mean. Father in the sort of way that popular imagination of the father, right? Where you see judgment to the father. The father is giving you answers, right? The father isn't inviting you to ask new questions. The father is telling you what the world is like. But then you grow up or you become older, and you start asking questions yourself, and healthy relationships with parents change, and become relationships between adults, and everyone can sort of ask their own questions, and there can still be a kind of democratic charisma that comes from the father after you've grown up, right? After you see that there's a kind of demystification of the father figure, which is really what can happen in religion at its best as well, right? Where at one time one might be drawn in by a kind of slickness of piety, but then demystification can the enchantment can sort of recede, but the calling, right, can still be there, and the calling no longer should be directed at a person, right, or a worldly institution, but at the good, the true, the beautiful, at justice, and that calling should be resistance to worldly forces and ideologies when religion is functioning at its best.
So somebody that you mentioned a little bit earlier as an example of democratic charisma is Martin Luther King Jr. And that he's like a good example of the ways that charisma can be used and are useful to us. There's like a really great line in your book where you say that King's charisma muted people's reason, but like that was a good thing because people reasoned according to like an oppressive logic, so it was like a helpful corrective. You also mentioned that this charisma occludes the more mundane work of social movements, actually building change on the ground. So could you talk a little bit more about how all of that functions sort of democratically and like what that part means? How does charisma like short circuit our usual thought, like the oppressive logic we live our life by? So yeah, I don't know. How does that work?
Sure. Yeah. And first, I should mention, there's a lot of great scholarship and some social criticism around King. Erica Edwards has a great book called Charisma and the Fictions of Black Leadership. She's a literature scholar and sort of looking at how Black women and sort of ordinary people if one sort of reads Black literature carefully, are always challenging the sort of heteronormative Black man who's sort of in a position of authority. So these sorts of challenges to figures who've been elevated into this role of charismatic leader, have been ongoing for and are just a part of social life in all sorts of communities, and particularly in marginalized communities where ideology, the limits of ideology are all the more apparent. With a figure like King, who again is equivocal. One of the things I talk about in the book is this novel by Charles Johnson, a Black writer of historical fiction and other fiction as well, who imagines what sort of imagined King behind the scenes, right? Particularly in his later days when he's in Chicago, when he's really struggling to catch, right? And King, in the sort of imagination, is and in reality became overdetermined by his image, right? He's imagined in the media as charismatic leader, and all he can do, no matter what he says, no matter what he does, is become play this role of charismatic leader. The sort of authoritarian charisma has totally he's become identified with this authoritarian charisma as much as he wants to escape it. So in this historical novel, there's actually a Johnson imagines what it would be like if charisma had a double, like a body double, who was able to express all the humanity that King can't express because he's so trapped in his own image.
Well, that's so fascinating to kind of look at how these two things, authoritarian and democratic charisma, kind of feed off of each other. They're on some kind of continuum, where you can sort of be promoting one and still get sucked in by the other one or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I imagine, King in the early days in Montgomery, where, he's just a young, basically a young kid right out of graduate school, right? Just finished his dissertation a few months before, and now there's this bus boycott, and he's, preaching, and, there it seems like he probably does have this kind of democratic charisma, right? He's encouraging people to ask questions that they hadn't asked before, right? System of segregation might have been frustrating, but, it seemed as if nothing could be done, and now, right, King is inviting people to think that the limits, to think the impossible, right? To think that the limits of possibility are not what they seemed before. That the system of segregation could be abolished, which seems like a really powerful kind of thing, and something that we want to praise, right? And something that was surprising at the time. But then, 10 years later. When every television screen has been showing images of King over and over again, the effect is of any new thing that King says is very very different. And all these worries about patriarchy and even nationalism, and even the sort of now that time has passed, is sort of incorporation of King into the American, becoming the quintessential American, right? And being used for capitalism, as we saw in the Super Bowl ad. These, he's just become authoritarian charisma with all of the bad things that always goes along with authoritarian charisma.
Yeah, that makes a bunch of sense, and it's really troubling. I remember there's a weird thing that Lenin says in State and Revolution about Marx, to the same respect, that I always think about with King, where he sort of says when revolutionaries die, everybody who hated them, while they were alive and revolutionary, suddenly sort of wants to appropriate them. And there is a real, I guess, power or capital to be gained by reinvesting that charisma toward other ends is something that's sort of troubling. I'm curious actually about how you think charisma feeds into leftist movements in particular. You mentioned Saul Alinsky in the book as an exemplar of democratic charisma, which I was interested by, but also kind of surprised by. He's also importantly anti-communist. Is there a room for a normatively good, charismatic leader in leftist party movements? How does this sort of relate to the stuff you were doing with Huey P. Newton, for example, who's a pretty charismatic party builder?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think what's so valuable about Alinsky is the sort of theorizing of organizing practice and of antagonism, right? The way that we need to sort of constitute a 99% against a 1%, even if those groups are imprecise, but forcing that antagonism, right? Forcing that conflict, and organizing deeply and carefully. At the grassroots among the 99%, right? If that's a language that one wants to adopt, is the prerequisite to creating any sort of serious movement toward justice. So I think in that theorization of organizing and of struggle for justice, Alinsky, has space for organizers, right? People coming from the outside, and with one foot outside and one foot inside a community, to catalyze community organizing, in part by build, I mean, not by giving a community answers, not by saying, you need to build a new bridge, you need to build a new park, you need a new community garden, but rather by, inviting community members to talk about, what is ailing our community, and then to go deeper to say who is causing, these things that are ailing our community. What are the systems that are causing these problems in our community, and then to identify an enemy, right, that can be targeted. Who is the boss who is causing these problems with toxic waste, or with no park space, or with labor working conditions, or whatever. Who is the leader that can be targeted for to affect change, but it's never the organizer who's sort of giving people answers, or attracting attention for him or herself. The organizer, ideally, is identifying and trying to give resources to and give aid to leaders that are already in the community, right? So, at the, in this sort of ideal type of the meeting where everyone is saying, here are the problems in our neighborhood, and here are the people who are behind the problems, here are the systems who are behind the problems. At those sorts of meetings, which I mentioned you all have been to and I've been to, right? You hear people who are unexpectedly eloquent, right? Neighbors, teachers, relatives who can talk about and can feel, right? Have passion for the deep injustices that are happening in a community, and that can sort of mobilize others, to organize with them, around those injustices and those systems of injustice. So the organizer can mobilize leaders, and the leaders can mobilize other members of community, and that way charisma becomes kind of contagious, right? One person passes it to others, who pass it to others. If it's democratic charisma, if it's authoritarian charisma, it's sort of hoarding all the attention for itself to the one individual with the authoritarian charisma. I mean, I do worry that I think with you that Alinsky doesn't go deep enough, right? Doesn't name ideology, doesn't name capitalism as a root problem, right? That needs to be combated, and doesn't name nationalism, right? Sometimes he gets into the being proud to be an American bit. That is reads as uncritical, but is sometimes probably employed more rhetorically than substantively. Anyway, I mean, Alinsky, has his limits, and socialist and hard left organizing of the kind that Huey Newton and others organizing today, are part of. It's just on an email thread with Kali Kuno in Jackson, Mississippi, who's part of the Malcolm X grassroots movement there, organizing to reclaim historically black territory for a project of black self-determination in the South, which is again a sort of thing that on the one hand, in some ideal world, it's just community members coming together, but on the other hand, in reality, it's democratic charisma that is catalyzing, that is bringing others forward, that is creating the spaces for others to express their own humanity, which will then call forth the humanity of others, which can then be mobilized against the systems of oppression, of which capitalism is the first and foremost.
You do mention Castro, I think, one time in passing, at least in the introduction. Fidel Castro is a person that we like to talk about a lot for some different reasons, and he seems like he's a figure that might exhibit both these charismatic elements. Sometimes he's authoritarian and maybe sometimes he's more democratic. What do you think of leaders like Castro or like other folks in revolutionary states in terms of charisma? How does that work out, or how can we think of them in terms of charisma?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there was a moment when social scientists got really excited about charisma because in the mind of social scientists, they just discovered all of these global South dictators who had this quality and were mobilizing all of these people around them and seemed to have cults of personality, and the social scientists wanted to explain it. That was one of the times that charisma sort of peaks forward, and people start making theories of charisma in a way that, charisma is a topic that people have talked about since Max Weber in a sort of theoretical sense, and since much earlier in a sort of theological sense. But there are sort of ebbs and flows in the amount of discussion there is about charisma. So that was a moment when there was more discussion of charisma, but at that moment there wasn't a lot of talk about discernment between good charisma and bad charisma that can open toward justice, and charisma that reinforces ideology, which has been a feature of the. One of the problems with charisma, and the things I was trying to grapple with, is that there's a social science literature on charisma, and then there's a theological literature on charisma. The theological literature, actually is interested in discerning, stuff about stuff that's true, right? Charisma that is a real gift of God, right? The social science literature is not, right? It's interested in describing a phenomenon that can be observed, and counted and measured, or at least classified. So, I wanted to think, what if we take that theological insight, right? That there could be a kind of charisma that digs deep, that goes beyond the world, right? And bring it together with this social science literature, which it does usefully think about varieties of political formation, and name some of the problems with authoritarian charisma, and deals with a lot of data, which can be useful to engage with. So, my book is trying to bring together these two different strands in the literature around charisma. But in terms of getting back to your question, around someone like Castro, right? So, I agree, and can consistently throughout the book that there's an equivocation that calls for discernment, right? Charisma that can, always, even with King, right? Even with Ella Baker, right? Even with, the sort of grassroots, most grassrootsy, most, queer women of color, right? Even in these sorts of contexts, can become authoritarian charisma. So that kind of suspicion that calls for us to think carefully and have exercise judgment informed by practices of community and so on. That's really important. But we shouldn't just be dismissing Castro along with Hitler, along with Stalin, along with Mussolini, right? This kind of judgment, right, this kind of discernment is what social scientists are so often lacking, but what theologians are so good at calling for. So, I think bringing that together for a figure like Castro is what we need.
I love that way of sort of picking apart the theological literature and social scientific literature. It is funny in a way, right? Like you put your finger on it there, that there's something about figuring out what actually matters in those structural phenomena for theological voices that I think is a really interesting thing, especially when you think about someone like Fidel Castro, right? Because there's so many really, really good and interesting things about what he's doing in Cuba that kind of get overlooked even by, I guess, like boring to me anyway, boring like structural analyses of it. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that in terms of American politics. There's this kind of vague rhetoric of populism on both the left and right now. And as people are trying to discern what that means, it seems like a conversation about charisma would be really important. Obviously, Donald Trump is probably a pretty authoritarian, charismatic figure. But it seemed like there was even an internal debate around charisma within like the Democratic primary, for example. So Bernie Sanders clearly tapped into a certain charismatic force, I guess, for better or worse. And then Clinton was also trying to tap into a charismatic force. As somebody who's been thinking about this, do you have any thoughts on the political terrain, I guess, in American politics related to those sort of trends that are emerging?
Yeah, so I do. The book doesn't say anything about Trump, but it does talk a little bit about Twitter charisma, which is maybe related to Trump and the kind of Twitter personalities that were advocating for Black Lives Matter after Ferguson, DeRay McKesson, of course, most famously, and thinking about the comparison between that kind of Twitter charisma, right, which has features of charisma, but also is does not expose the human, right? Is giving answers, is offering judgments that an audience can then borrow or be given or swallow and regurgitate. Whereas the Democratic charisma of the three women who coined the hashtag Black Lives Matter, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, was charisma rooted in grassroots organizing. Even if there was a little bit of Twitter usage, there was also a lot of public speaking and rallies and the sort of hard work of organizing and meetings and planning and strategizing and so on. I think in terms of I don't have a lot of patience for electoral politics because I think it can grab our attention and take so much affective investment, particularly of people who otherwise have reasonably good political judgment, right? They start talking about electoral politics and soon, all of this sort of affective energy is invested in it when, that's not where the revolution is going to happen, right? It's, in the sort of electoral political sphere, right? It's in grassroots organizing of marginalized communities, marginalized for a variety of reasons, communities that is where real politics oriented toward justice happens, and that's where one should be looking for democratic charisma and worried about authoritarian charisma. The realm of politics is like the realm of celebrity, right? It's the realm of electoral politics is like the realm of celebrity, right? Overdetermined by this authoritarian charisma just circulating ideology. But in Bernie Sanders at the best of that movement, and Obama 2008 at the best of that movement, right? There's a mobilization of people on the ground who care about justice, right? Who are not fully formed in their politics, right? Who are learning about organizing, who are learning about the forces of evil and ideology that will try to crush struggles for justice, right? And learning the practical skills of organizing that can be acquired and refined in electoral political campaigns, and those. Looking behind the candidates or bracketing the candidate and looking at the organizing practices on the ground. That's the place to look for the kind of for what matters politically.
I guess on that point, so like you said, the revolution isn't coming from electoral politics, but from other places, marginalized communities. On that note, though, you talk about a lot of ways to sort of understand charisma, and that is, I think, a really helpful tool for the toolbox of analysis. What do you think about, how do we just be more charismatic? You said a few minutes ago, too, that democratic charisma is one of those things that kind of spreads, but I guess, how do we practice it? How do we become good at being charismatic in, the democratic sort of way?
Yeah, so if you search for charisma on Amazon.com, there are a whole bunch of how to become charismatic books. The first results that come up, and so on the one hand, that I want to say, this is just a symptom of sort of managerial culture, right? It's how to be a charismatic middle manager in some big corporation, or how to become a charismatic person and so meet the love of your life or something like that. The sort of charisma in a way that is not oriented at all toward justice. But on the other hand, right, the sense that charisma, there's something about it that's like a virtue that can be cultivated in community. I mean, that does seem important to think through and to commend. And I don't. The book doesn't end with sort of 10 steps towards becoming a person with democratic charisma.
Dang.
Chapter, but through practices of discernment, right, by trying to figure out how to disentangle authoritarian charisma from democratic charisma. I mean, I think that opens one to democratic charisma, and when you're open to democratic charisma, you yourself start becoming more charismatic, right? But I mean, most of all, I mean, I don't think not to be too materialist about these things, but it's if one is in if the material conditions are right, if one is disenfranchised in certain ways, in whatever ways, right? We're all disenfranchised in some ways, right? And finds the self-awareness to sort of recognize those that kind of disenfranchisement, and finds others who share that kind of disenfranchisement, right? And allows oneself and to speak about it, and hears others speaking about it, and does this sort of thing that happens in the community organizing meetings of talking about what's wrong in our neighborhood, what's wrong with what are the injustices that we're facing, how they're not just my injustices but they're shared by others around me. And we can, identify where they're coming from, what systems are behind those individuals or corporations that are causing them, and then, challenging those systems. I mean, through that practice of organizing, one becomes the endpoint ... is democratic charisma. Right?
Yeah. Huh, that's really cool. That makes sense to me.
Yeah, for sure. It's funny to think about all that just with respect to movement building because, charisma is it's a thing that I guess theoretically it makes sense that people are suspicious of. But in practice, I don't know, I like getting excited about other people, right? like if someone gets me excited about an issue, that's a really cool and valuable thing. Being at a rally or something and hearing somebody speak about the problems that their community is facing, or being at an organized meeting and hearing someone speak with confidence about actually getting something done, at least in my experience, that's the kind of thing that inspires me to kind of keep doing things and believe that I could actually do something, as opposed to getting stuck in a kind of temptation to be resigned to the way that things are. I think there's something to just taking that really seriously. Maybe that's the thing I'm taking away most from your book and even how you're talking about it now, is that it's important to kind of face up to not only the fact that we all kind of participate in charismatic relationships, but in fact it's not a bad thing, and there are good things if we can only think really hard about what those things are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thanks. I'm glad I'm glad it makes sense and seems compelling. I mean, I think one of the things that I've also been trying to think through in the Me Too era is the relationship between charisma and seduction, and the kind of dangers that are made really explicit when authoritarian about the connections between authoritarian charisma and patriarchy, and sexual violence, and it seems like if that's something we're worried about, we also want to retain a way of talking about love, right? And appreciating the phenomenon of love. And I'm trying to figure out whether democratic charisma might be a way of, naming something like love in the sort of interpersonal realm in an era where we're rightly concerned with the way that something like authoritarian charisma and patriarchy are doing so much real violence to people's lives.
Well, thanks a lot, Vincent, for just chatting us up about all the stuff that you're working on now. We're excited to see how you keep working on it. I mean, it sounds like there's so much more to be explored and things that you're already kind of still thinking about after having written a whole book on the topic, which I guess is a good sign that the labor is fruitful and productive. I mean, I wish you luck on all your charismatic writing ventures and organizing ventures.
Thank you very much for the time to talk. And of course, I wrote something about charisma because I have no charisma, and I'm trying to figure out what this thing is that other people have. So I'm still going to try and figure it out.
Well, we're glad to have you on here anyway. We find you very charismatic enough to have you around twice. So you've entered the club of 2-time Magnificast guests. It's a very coveted spot. So congrats.
Thank you. Yes, I'll look forward to lapping Derek Ford in the coming months.
That's right.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you don't already, you should be following us on Twitter, subscribing to us on iTunes, subscribing to us on SoundCloud, and get into the Magnificast basement on Facebook, because there's lots of good posts and discussions there. It's been really picking up lately. It's been fun seeing all those posts. Sometimes I can't stop and participate, but I always like them. Sometimes I can participate though, so you can interact with us in a really Facebooky kind of way. So cool. You can also find our podcast on Theology Corner, so check that out, and also on Critical Mediations. Those are 2 podcast networks that we belong to, and you can also go and listen to the other good content on those websites. Friendly Anarchism is on both of them, so just listen to our podcast and listen to Friendly Anarchism twice, and then you're good. Cool, so thanks for listening. See you next time.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late.